The convictions of an apprentice statesman. The moment of responsibility is profoundly sobering, especially for one trained as an academic, suddenly forced to make the transition from reflection to decision. I had to learn the difference between a conclusion and a policy. It was no longer enough to be plausible in argument. One had to be convincing in actions. Problems were no longer theoretical. The interlocutors were not debaters but sovereign countries, some of which had the physical power to make their views prevail. Any statesman is in part the prisoner of necessity. He is confronted with an environment he did not create and shaped by a personal history he can no longer change. It is an illusion to believe that leaders gain profundity while they gain experience. As I have said, the convictions that leaders have formed for recent high office are the intellectual capital they will consume as long as they continue in office. There is little time for leaders to reflect. They are locked in an endless battle in which the urgent constantly gains on the important. The public life of every political figure is a continual struggle to rescue an element of choice from the pressure of circumstance. When I entered office, I brought with me a philosophy formed by 2 decades of the study of history. History is not, of course, a cookbook offering pre-tested recipes. It teaches by analogy, not by maxims. It can illuminate the consequences of actions in comparable situations. Yet each generation must discover for itself what situations are in fact comparable. No academic discipline can take from our shoulders the burden of difficult choices. I have written a book and several articles on the diplomacy of the 19th century. My motive was to understand the process by which Europe, after the Napoleonic Wars, established a peace that lasted a century. I also wanted to know why peace collapsed in 1914, but I have never conceived the designs and strategies previous periods could be applied literally to the present. As I entered office, I was convinced that the past could teach us some important lessons, but I also was aware that we were entering a period for which there was no precedent in the destructiveness of weapons, in the speed and spread of ideas, in the global impact of foreign policies, in the technical possibility to fulfill the age-old dreams of bettering the conditions of mankind. If history teaches anything, it is there can be no peace without equilibrium and no justice without restraint. But I believe equally no nation can face or even define its choices without a moral compass that set a course through the ambiguities of reality and thus make sacrifices meaningful. The willingness to walk this fine line marks the difference between the academic or any other outsider's perceptions of morality and that of the statesman. The outsider thinks in terms absolute. For him, right and wrong are defined in their conception. The political leader does not have this luxury. He rarely can reach his goals except in stages. Any partial step is inherently morally imperfect, yet morality cannot approximate without it. The philosopher's test is the reasoning behind his maxim. The statesman test is not the exhaustion of his goals, but the catastrophes that he averts. Mankind will never know what it was spared because risks avoided or because the actions taken averted the awful consequences, if only because once thwarted the consequences can never be proved. The dialogue between the academic and the statesman is therefore always likely to be inconclusive. Without philosophy, policy will have no standards. Without the willingness to peer into the darkness and risk some faltering steps without certainty, humanity will never know peace. History knows no resting place and no plateaus. All societies of which history informs us went through periods of decline, and most of them eventually collapsed. Yet there is a margin between necessity and accident, in which the statesman by perseverance into intuition must choose and thereby shape the destiny of his people. To ignore objective conditions is perilous. To hide behind historical inevitability is tantamount to moral abdication. Is to neglect the elements in strength and hope and inspiration which through the century has sustained mankind. The statesman's responsibility is to struggle against the transitionists, and not to insist he be paid in the coin of eternity. He may know that history is a foe of preeminence, but no leader is entitled to realization. He owes it to the people to strive to create and to resist the decay that besets all human institutions. The American experience. I reached high office unexpectedly at a particular complex, the period of our national life. In the life of nations, as of human beings, a point is often reached when the seemingly limitless possibilities of youth suddenly narrow, and one must come to grips with the fact that not every option is open any longer. This insight can inspire a creative impetus, less innocent perhaps than the naive exuberance of the earlier years, but more complex and ultimately more permanent. The process of coming to grips with one's limits is never easy. It can end in despair or in rebellion. It can produce a self-hatred that turns inevitable compromises into a sense of inadequacy. America went through such a period of self-doubt and self-hatred in the late 1960s. The trigger for it was the war in Vietnam, entered gradually by two administrations. By 1969, it had resulted in over 31,000 Americans dead, with no prospect of early resolution. It began irreverently, public and congressional approval, but this had evolved first into skepticism and then to increasingly hostile rebellion. For too many, a war to resist regression had turned into a symbol of fundamental American evil. A decade had begun with the bold declaration that America will pay any price and bear any burden to assure the survival and success of liberty, had ended in agony assassinations, urban riots, and ugly demonstrations. The 60s marked the end of our innocence. This was certain. What remained to be determined was whether we can learn from this knowledge or consume or our substance in rebelling against the reality of our maturity. The turmoil of the 1960s was all more unsettling to Americans because it came at the end of an extraordinary period of American accomplishment. We have built alliances that preserve the peace, fostered the growth of industrial democracies in North America, Western Europe, and Japan. We have created international economic institutions that had nourished global prosperity for a generation. We have promoted decolonization and pioneered in development assistance for new nations. In a planet struck by communication and technology, in a world either devastated by war or struggling in the first steps of nationhood, the United States had every reason to take pride in its global contribution. Its energy, idealism, and enduring accomplishment. The fact remained, at the end of the 20 years of exertion, America was not at peace with itself. The consensus that sustained our post-war foreign policy had evaporated. The men and women who had sustained our international commitments and achievements were demoralized by what they considered their failure in Vietnam. Too many of our young were in rebellion against the successes of their fathers, attacking what they claimed to be the overextension of our commitments and mocking the values that animated their achievements. A new isolationism was growing, whereas in the 1920s we had withdrawn from the world because we thought we were too good for it. The insidious theme of the late 1960s was that we should withdraw from the world because we were too evil for it. Not surprisingly, America, self-doubt, proved contagious. It is hard for foreign nations to have more faith in a country than it has in itself. European intellectuals began to argue that the Cold War was caused by Americans as well as by the Soviet policies. They urged their governments to break out this vicious circle by peace initiatives of their own. Many European leaders catering to this move became fervent advocates of detente, playing the role of a bridge between East and West, visiting Moscow, exploring ties with Peking, earning disarmament in East and West trade. These protections were all very well, until the United States in the late 60s began to take them to heart and adopt the policy implicit in them. Suddenly, European statesmen reversed course. Now they were fearful of U.S. Soviet conundrum, a super yatta, in which the Americans and the Soviet leaders were settled global issues over the heads of the European government. In the year that saw the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, the United States was accused by many of its allies being at one and the same time too Belarus in Southeast Asia and too accommodating in its dealings with the Soviet Union. This ambivalence gnawed at the unity of the alliance. Unnerved by the events in Czechoslovakia, pressed by public opinion toward conciliation, impelled by the conviction to strengthen security, the Western Alliance was become like a ship dead in the water. Similar uncertainty marked our other policies. For 2 decades, our contacts with China had been limited to reciprocal recriminations of sporadic ambassadorial meetings in Warsaw. The Middle East was explosive, but in the aftermath of the 1967 war, no diplomacy was in train. Our domestic divisions prevented decisive initiatives. America seemed to reduce passivity in a world in which, with all our self-doubt, only our power could offer security, only our dedication could sustain hope. In my view, Vietnam was not cause of our difficulties, but a symptom. We were in a period of painful adjustment to profound transformation of global politics. We were forced to come to grips with the tension between our history and our new necessities. For 2 centuries, America's participation in the world seemed to oscillate between the over-involvement and withdrawal, between expecting too much of our power and being ashamed of it, between optimistic exuberance and frustration with the ambiguities of an imperfect world. I was convinced that the deepest cause of our national unease was the realization as yet dimly perceived that we were becoming like other nations and the need to recognize that our own power, while vast, had limits. Our resources were no longer infinite in relation to our problems. Instead, we had to set priorities, both intellectual and material. In the 50s and 60s, had attempted the ultimate solutions to specific problems. Now our challenge was to shape a world and an American role to which we were permanently committed, which could no longer be sustained by the illusion that our exertions had a turning point. An administration elected in 1968 would have faced this problem. It was a colossal risk, colossal task. In the best of circumstances, the war in Vietnam turned into a serious and agonizing enterprise. Our history ill-prepared us. Ironically, our founding fathers were reciprocated statesmen who understood the European balance of power and manipulated it brilliantly, first to bring about American independence and then to preserve it. The shrewd diplomacy of Franklin and Jefferson to engage enemies, France, Spain, and Russia, on our side, our negotiating hand thus straightened. John Jay secured recognition from the British Crown and liquidated from the residual problems of our war with England. At that point, however, in the best tradition of the European balance of power, we cut loose from our temporary allies and went on our own way. For more than 3 decades after independence, we lived precariously like other nations. We went to the brink of war with France and endured a capture of our capital by British forces, but we moved astutely to take advantage of new opportunities. The effective elimination of France and Spain from the Western Hemisphere, the new danger of Russian expansion in the Pacific Northwest, and the Great Britain growing estrangement with European nations led us in 1823 to concert the Monroe Doctrine, with Britain to exclude European power from our hemisphere. Britain's perspective was that the European equilibrium. Prime Minister Canning perceived the Monroe Doctrine called the New World into existence to address the balance of the old, but in the New World, it meant that we were free to turn our backs on Europe and to devote our energies to open up the continent to the west of us. For 100 years between Waterloo and 1914, we were shielded by our geographic remoteness, British sea power, which maintained global stability. As the United States grew in strength, European rivalries focused on Europe, Africa, and Asia. Americans came to consider the isolation conferred by 2 great oceans as a normal pattern of foreign relations. Rather arrogantly, we ascribe our security entirely to the superiority of our beliefs, rather than the rate of our power or the fortune of accidents of history and geography. After the Napoleonic upheaval, America stood apart from European conflicts throughout the 19th century, although in order to run out our national territory and maintain our national unity, we fought as many wars as any European country and probably suffered more casualties, but these wars were not seen in terms of the concept of international relations. To Americans, they reflected the imperatives of a manifest destiny. Americans, however, whether Mayflower descendants or refugees from the failed revolutions of 1848, came to assume that we were immune from the necessities that impelled other nations. There was, of course, also a pragmatic and realistic strain. Admiral Mahon's perception of the role of sea power proved that Americans could think profoundly in geopolitical terms. The methods by which we acquired the Philippines and the Panama Canal proved that power politics was not entirely neglected. Nevertheless, American political thought had come increasingly regard diplomacy with suspicion. Arms and alliances were considered immoral and reactionary. Negotiations were treated less as a means of reconciling our ideals with our interests than as a trap to entangle us in the endless quarrels of a morally questionable world. Our naive inclinations for straightforwardness, our instinct for open and nosy politics, our distrust of European manners and continental elites all brought about an increasing impatience with the stylized methods of European diplomacy and with its tendency towards ambiguous compromise. In its day, even the purchase of Alaska, which finally ejected Russia from our continent, was regarded as a tolerant folly, explicable only by American gullibility in the face of the old world diplomatic machinations. Congress prevailed only with the greatest difficulty to appropriate $7 million to complete the deal. The mythology of foreigners, guideful superiority in the ways that diplomacy was carried in the 20th century. Will Rogers, always assured a laugh when he cracked America, never lost a war and never won a conference. Thus America entered the 20th century largely unprepared for the part it would be called upon to play. Forgotten was the skilled statecraft by which the founding fathers had secured our independence. Disdained were the techniques by which all nations must perceive their interests. As Lord Bryce observed in 1888, the American Commonwealth, America had been sailing on a summer sea, but now on a cloud bank on the horizon, and no longer distant, a time of mist and shadows, wherein dangers may be concealed, whose form and magnitude she can scarcely conjecture. Though America was not to grasp its consequences for many decades, the Pax Americana, on which we have relying for so long, was ending. We developed into the world major economic power, and we were fast becoming the only democratic nation with a sufficient strength to maintain a precarious world balance. Our entry into World War I was the inevitable result of our geopolitical interests in maintaining freedom of the seas and preventing Europe's domination by a hostile power. But true to our tradition, we choose to interpret our participation in legal and idealistic terms. We fought the war to end all wars and to make the world safe with democracy. The inevitable disillusion with an imperfect outcome let loose the tide of isolationism. We fell back on our preference for law and repeated attempts to legislate an end to international conflict. Automatic machinery for collective security and new disarmament schemes, the Kellogg-Briand Pact to ban war, our refusal to accept foreign policy that must start with security led us in the interwar year to treat allies as rivals, whose armaments had to be limited because weapons, by definition, contributed to international tensions. We look for scapegoats, the so-called munition makers, to explain why he ever engaged in such a sordid undertaking as the First World War. Intelligence services were considered unworthy, if not a threat to our own liberties. Economic activity was seen as the only defensible form of American involvement abroad. Its objectives were either humanitarian, incentivized by the relief efforts of Herbert Hoover, or essentially passive, free trade as advocated by Cordell Hull. Later, when totalitarianism was on the rise and the entire international order was being challenged, we clung to our isolation, which had been transformed from a policy preference into a moral conviction. We had virtually abandoned the basic precautions that needed for our national security. Only with the greatest difficulty could President Roosevelt take the first tentative steps against the mounting threat against Great Britain by subterfuge and rebuilding our military might. The Second World War was well underway before we were shocked out of our isolations by a surprise attack against American soil, but then in our absorption with the total victory spurred the notion that security of the post-war might depend on some sort of equilibrium of power. We were, thus, much surprised by the war's aftermath. The central fact of the post-war period was the destruction of Germany and Italy and the exhaustion of Britain and France drew Soviet power into the heart of the European continent, and for a while seemed to place Western Europe at the Soviet mercy. Moscow renewed ideological hostility, increasingly challenged our comfortable wartime assumption about the post-war international harmony, and our scientists had unleashed the atom, ushering in a revolution in weaponry that set our age apart from all had gone before. When D. Axon said he was present at the creation. He referred not only to the creation of our post-war foreign policy, but to a new era in our own history. After two world wars in a century, the responsibilities and burdens of world leadership proved inescapable. The United States had, despite itself, become the guardian of the new equilibrium. Its lasting credit of the generation of Americans that they assume responsibilities with energy, imagination, and skill by helping Europe rebuild and encouraging European unity, shaping institutional and economic cooperation, and extending the protections of our alliances. They say the possibilities of freedom. This burst of creativity is one glorious moment of American history. Yet this period of exuberance was bound to wane, if only because inevitably encountered the consequences of our new success. The recovery of Europe and Japan required adjustments in our alliance relations. The developing world of new nations whose independence we have promoted was certain to claim a greater share of the global prosperity, and nothing we could have done would have prevented the Soviet Union from recovering from the war and asserting its new power. Our early post-war successes did not equip us for a new era of more complex problems. Our early programs, like the Marshall Plan and Point 4, express our idealism, our technological know-how, and our ability to overcome problems with resources. In a sense, we are applying the precepts of our own New Deal, expecting political conflicts to dissolve in economic progress. It worked in Europe and parts of Asia, where political structure existed. It would be less relevant in the scores of new nations. In the relatively simple bipolar war of the Cold War, we held fast against the pressure of blackmail in Berlin, in Korea, and Berlin again, and finally during the Cuban Missile Crisis. These were successes, but in an important sense, we have only begun to scratch the surface of the long-term problem of our relationship with the Soviet Union in the thermonuclear age, which soon produced the more ambiguous challenges. Our deeper problem was conceptual, because peace was believed to be normal. Many of our great international exertions were expected to bring about a final result, restoring normality by overcoming a intervening obstacle. The program for the European economic recovery was expected to bring a lasting prosperity. Assertions to ensure security was aimed at a conclusive settlement with the Soviet Union. This was implicit in the concept of containment that was expressed our post-war policy towards the Soviet Union. According to George Kennan, the famous ex-article in Foreign Affairs in 1947, our task was to resist Soviet probes and was counterforce patiently awaiting the mellowing of the Soviet system, as applied in the diplomacy of Dean Axon and some extent John Foster Dulles. We were marked the time until we built the strength to contain Soviet aggression, especially the assault of Central Europe, while preoccupied our strategic thinking. After containment had been achieved, diplomacy would take over. What we must do, said Secretary of State Axon, is to create a situation of strength. We must build strength, and if we create the strength, I think the whole situation in the world begins to change. And with that change, there comes a difference in negotiating positions of various parties, and of that, I should hope that it will be willingness on the part of the Kremlin to recognize the facts. The definition of containment treated power and diplomacy as two distinct elements or phases of policy. It aimed at ultimate negotiation, but supplied no guide to the content of those negotiations. It implied the strength was self-evident. and that once negotiations started their content, it will be also self-evident. It did not answer the question of how the situation of strength was to be demonstrated in the absence of a direct attack on us or on our allies, nor did it make clear what would happen after we achieved a position of strength if our adversary, instead of negotiating, concentrated on rewarding it or turning on our flank. The policy of containment was flawed in three ways. First, our excessive military conception of the balance of power and its corollary, the policy of deferring negotiations for a post-war settlement, paradoxically gave the Soviet Union time to consolidate its conquest and to redress the nuclear imbalance. To be sure the immediate post-war period, the massive Soviet armies in Central Europe were much larger than the forces arrayed against them. Western Europe was postulating the United States was demobilized, but the real strength of the Soviet Union was but a fraction of our own. The Soviet Union had been exhausted by 4 years of war and 20 million casualties. We had an atomic monopoly and for 20 years a vast nuclear superiority. Our relative strength was never greater than at the beginning of what soon came to be called the Cold War. Secondly, the nature of military technology was such a balance of power could no longer thought of as a uniform. Nuclear weapons were so cataclysmic that as arsenals grew, proved less and less useful to repel every conceivable aggression. For a while, this reality was obscured by our nuclear monopoly, and later by the numerical preponderance. But the point was neverly reached by the technology enabled the Kremlin to pose risks that reduced the credibility of the threat of nuclear retaliation. From then on, managing military balance of power required vigilance on two levels: being strong enough not only strategically with nuclear weapons, but also locally with conventional arms. Formal declarations unimpaired sincerity of our nuclear guarantee will not remove the fact of nuclear deadlock, yet the consequence of requirement for alternate regional defenses, yet every decade has had to relearn the essential duality of our burden. Thirdly, our doctrine of containment can never be adequate to response to the modern impact of the communist ideology, with transform relations between states into conflicts between philosophies and pose challenges to the balance of power through domestic upheavals. In short, we will never fully understood that while the absolute power was growing, our relative position was bound to decline as the USSR recovered from World War II. Our military and diplomatic position was never favorable than at the very beginning of the containment policy in the late 1940s. That was the time to attend a serious discussion of the future of Europe. We lost our opportunity. In fact, I am inclined to doubt that Stalin had originally expected to lock all of Eastern Europe into a Stalin-like orbit. His first post-war steps, such as permitting free elections in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, all of which the communist laws suggest he might have been prepared to settle for having a status similar to Finland's. Unexpectedly, we deferred the serious negotiations until we had mobilized more of our potential strength. Thus, we gave the Soviet Union time, the most precious commodity it needed to consolidate its conquest and recover from the war. As so often before, Winston Churchill understood this best. In a much neglected speech in October 1948, during his period out of office, he said, and I quote, "The question is asked, what will happen? Will they get the atomic bomb themselves and accumulate a large store? You can judge yourselves what will happen then by what's happening now. If these things are done in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? If they continue And a month after the month of disturbing and tormenting the world, trusting our Christian and altruistic inhibitions against using the strange new power against them, what will they do when themselves have launched quantities of atomic bombs? No one, in his sense, can believe we had a limitless period of time before us. We ought to bring matters to a head and make a final settlement. We ought not to be jogging along improvement and competent, waiting for something to turn up, by which I mean waiting for something bad for us to turn up. The Western nations will be far likely to reach a lasting settlement without bloodshed if they formulate their just demands while they have the atomic power before the Russian communists have gotten to. So, it happened in the first 2 years in which America engaged after 1945 in Korea and Vietnam did not correspond to any other political and strategic expectations. Korea was not initiated by attack on the United States or our major allies. It was not the aim of the heartland of Europe, nor directly involved the USSR. Little wonder that the responsible in Washington saw a strategic diversion to draw us into Asia while the Soviet Union prepared an onslaught in Europe. Our conduct of the war was therefore tentative. Our objectives fluctuated with the military situation at various times of our aims was declared to be repelling aggression, the unification of Korea, the security of our forces, or a guarantee armistice ratify the military stalemate. Our perception of power and diplomacy as distinct and successive in the phase of the foreign policy prevented us from negotiating to settle the Korean War after the landing in Incheon, when we were at the strongest in the military position. It tempted us to escalate our aims. A year later, it also caused us to stop the military operation and set on purely defensive nature. And the moment negotiation got underway, the removing enemies major incentive for a rapid diplomatic settlement, we acted as if the process of negotiation operated on its own inherent logic, independent of military balance, and the military pressure might jeopardize the negotiation by antagonizing our adversaries or demonstrating bad faith. Not surprisingly, a stalemate of nearly 2 years' duration followed, during which our casualties equaled those we have endured when hostilities was unconstrained. Treating force and diplomacy as discrete phenomena caused our power to lack purpose and our negotiation to lack force. This resulted in domestic coercion, and that represented the first breach of the new national consensus of foreign policy. The conflict between General Douglas MacArthur, the civilian and the military leadership in Washington. MacArthur advocated victory in the Far East. His critics argue, among other things, that we had to conserve our strength for a possible imminent all-out test with the Soviet Union, probably in Europe. MacArthur objected to his directives because they seemed to him too confining in the terms of the traditional concept of war. To the political leadership, on the other hand, Korea was a strategic diversion. It was too big a war in the terms of Washington perception of Europe as the divisive arena. Given the threat the growing Soviet nuclear arsenal would soon pose, it is possible to doubt the premises that the time was on our side, or that we had more to lose from an all-out war with than the Soviet Union. The paradox we never saw was that we entered the Korean War because we were afraid that to fail to do so produce a much greater danger to Europe in the near future. But then the very reluctance to face all-out onslaught on Europe was severely circumcised the risks we were prepared to run to prevail in Korea, resulting in a deadlock, sapped the domestic cohesion, and contributed to the assault of our liberties in the form of McCarthyism. 10 years later, we encountered the same dilemma in Vietnam. Once more, we became involved because we consider warfare in Indochina the manifestation of a coordinated global communist strategy. Again, we sought to limit our risk because the very global challenge of which Indochina seemed to be part also made Vietnam appear as an unprofitable place for a showdown. At every stage, we sought to keep our risk below the level in which, in our estimate, will trigger a Chinese or Soviet intervention. In short, our perception of the global challenge at the same time tempted us into distant enterprises and prevailed us from meeting conclusively. Once again, a war we had entered with a great public support and turned into a frustrating stalemate that gradually forfeited public acceptance. By 1969, the war in Vietnam had become a national nightmare that stimulated an attack of our entire post-war foreign policy. Hitherto, almost unanimous conviction that the Cold War had been caused by Soviet intransigence was challenged by the vocal and at times violent minority, which began to insist that American velocity, American militarism, and American economic imperialism were the root causes of international tensions. The homegrown radicalism had many true adherents. It clashed institutionally. Once we left Vietnam, what is striking is not so much its temporary appeal as its shattering effect in its demoralizing very groups that might have been expected to defend the premise and accomplishment of our post-war policy. The internationalist establishment, which had been responsible for the great achievements of our foreign policy, collapsed before the onslaught of its children who questioned all its values. The new Nixon administration was the first of the post-war generation that had to conduct foreign policy without the national consensus that has sustained its predecessors largely since 1947. And our task, if anything, more complex. We have faced not only dislocations of the war, but we need to articulate a new foreign policy for a new era. Sooner or later, the Vietnam War will end. What were the global challenges we face? What were our goals in the world? Could we shape a new consensus that reconcile our idealism and our responsibility, our security and our values, our dreams and our possibilities? The problems of the new equilibrium. Even as we enter office, it was clear that the agony of Vietnam threatened a new disillusionment with international affairs that could draw America inward to nurse its wounds and announce its world leadership. This would be a profound tragedy, far more grievous than the tragedy of Vietnam itself. We will be back on our historical cycle of exuberant overextension and soaking isolationism. And this time we be forsaking a world far more complex, more dangerous, and more dependent upon America's leadership and the world of the 1930s. Therefore, the Nixon administration saw as its task to lay the foundation for a long range of American foreign policies, even while liquidating our Indochina involvement. Crisis management, the academic focus of the 60s, was no longer enough. Crisis was a symptom of a deeper problem which allowed the professor to prove increasingly unmanageable. Moral exuberance had both inspired and over-involvement in isolationism. It was my conviction that a concept of our fundamental national interest provide a ballast of a restraint and assurance of continuity. Our idealism had not to be an excuse for irresponsibility, but a source of courage, stamina, self-confidence, and direction. Only in this matter will we be able to shape the emerging international system that was unprecedented in its perils, its promise, and its global nature. Since we were beset by a malaise deeper than Vietnam, its solution was a matter of expertise and philosophy. In an essay published a few weeks ago before the 1960 8. Election. When I had no inkling that I would be I had no inkling that I would be asked to put my ideas to the test, I wrote, "The contemporary unrest is no doubt exploited by some purpose, or all too clear, but there's no exploit is the proof of a profound dissertation with merely managerial and consumer-oriented qualities of the modern state. And with the world which seems to generate crisis by inertia, the modern bureaucratic state, for all its panoply of strengths, often finds itself shaken to its foundation by seemingly trivial causes. Its brittleness and worldwide revolution of youth, especially in the advance of countries among relatively affluent, suggests a spiritual void, an almost metaphysical boredom, with a political environment increasingly emphasizes the bureaucratic challenges and it's dedicated to no deeper purpose than the material comfort. In the best of circumstances, the next administration will be set to crisis. In almost every area of the world, we have living off capital warding or immediate and rarely dealing with underlying problems. These difficulties are likely to multiply when it becomes apparent that one of the legacies of the war in Vietnam will be a strong American reluctance to risk overseas involvements. A new administration has the right to ask for the compassionate understanding from the American people, but it must find its claim not on technical answers to difficult issues, but must be all ask the right questions. It must recognize that in the field of foreign policy, we will never be able to contribute to the building stable and creative world order unless we first form some conception of it. The most obvious challenge that marked our period was the transformation in the nature of power. Until the beginning of the nuclear age, it would have been inconceivable that a country could possess too much military strength for effective political use. Every addition of power was, at least theoretically and politically, useful. The nuclear age destroyed this traditional measure. A country must be strong enough to destroy an adversary, yet no longer was able to protect its own population against attack. By irony of history, a gargantuan increase in power had eroded the relationship of power to policy. Henceforth, the major nuclear powers would be able to devastate one another, but they will also have great difficulty in bringing their power to bear on most issues most likely to arise. This might able to deter direct challenges to their own survival. They could not necessarily use their power to impose their will. Their capacity to destroy proved difficult to translate into a plausible threat, even against countries with no capacities for retaliation. The margins of superpowers over non-nuclear power states have been widening, yet the awesomeness of their power had increased their ambitions. As power grown more awesome, it had also turned abstract, intangible, and elusive. The military policy we adopted was deterrence. But deterrence is a psychological phenomenon. It depends above all what a potential aggressor considers an unacceptable risk. In the nuclear age, a bluff taken seriously is useful. A serious threat taken as a bluff may be proved disastrous. The longer deterrence succeeds, the more difficult it is to demonstrate what made it work. Was peace maintained by the risk of war, or because the adversary never intended the aggression in the first place? It is no accident that the peace movements have multiplied the longer the peace has been maintained. But if deterrence is effectual, then we must dismantle the forces that sustain it only at our own great peril. Nuclear weapons had confounded the political rigidity of a two-power world. The guardians of the equilibrium of the 19th century were prepared to adjust its changes in the structure of power. The policy makers of the superpowers in the second half of the 20th century have much less confidence in the ability of the equilibrium to right itself after the disturbance. The balance between the superpowers had become precarious and inflexible. As the world had grown bipolar, it has lost the perspective for nuance, and the gain of one side appear as an absolute loss for another. Every issue seems to bear the question of survival. Diplomacy turned rigid. Relations are inherently wary. At the same time, strangely enough, military bipolarity was enough encouraged and not the mission. The global diffusion of political power. Smaller countries are torn between the desire for potential and a wish to escape big power dominance. To the degree smaller allies doubt that their senior partner will risk its own survival to preserve theirs, they are driven to seek some independent means for defending themselves. Even when they do count on the senior partner to defend them, they are all more tempted to conduct independent foreign policy, even in the defiance of its wishes. Is it probable that Charles de Gaulle bold challenge to the United States in the 1960s reflected more his conviction that the United States would have no choice to defend France in the case of the Soviet attack than his proclaimed fear that we would not? Similarly, the new nations have proved truly adept at playing the superpowers against each other, even while the military predominance of the superpower is enormous and growing. Every new president soon learned that he faced similarly contradictory obligations. He must assemble an adequate strength to protect the security of America and its allies and friends, and he must face, too, the moral necessity of avoiding a nuclear war. If he proceed otherwise, he will forfeit the domestic support he needs should a confrontation prove unavoidable. He must assemble power and discipline its use. He maintains America's readiness for defense and peace. He can do neither without a public that has confidence in its purposes, for he can act as a practical guide. The president must establish his moral leadership. The looseness of a problem of peace would have been difficult enough in any circumstance in our time. Is compounded by ideological conflict. Imperialists, heavily influenced by ideology, political loyalties no longer coincide with national boundaries. Communist parties everywhere adhere to a philosophy that asserts universality and historical inevitability, and play allegiance to a foreign nation, often in conflict with their own. Many new nations, swept by ideology whose tenet, if not communism, is powerfully anti-Western in the name of anti-imperialism, a crucial new conflict in the struggle between the moderates and radicals in the developing world. In such conditions, the domestic upheaval in any country can cause a major shift in international alignments. Nations begin to feel threatened not by foreign policies, but also and perhaps especially a domestic transformation. A liberalized communist regime in Prague, in which no way challenged Soviet preeminence in foreign policy, calls the Soviet Union in 1968 to invade and rather risk a contagion of ideas that it feared it could spread elsewhere in its empire. 10 years later, in the upheaval in Iran shook the stability throughout the Middle East. And all the confrontation and uncertainties were being played out for the first time on the global scale. Throughout history, continents have never had existed in relative isolation. As late as the outbreak of the Second World War, the crucial decision in the world politics taken in a few European capitals. The post-war period was the first of which all continents interacted. In 1945, the world community comprised of 51 nations. By 1968, it had more than doubled, nearly 130. Modern communication transmitted news and ideas instantaneously. Even events that used to be local, wars and rivalry and scandals, domestic upheavals, natural tragedies, suddenly began to consume global significance. When the Nixon administration entered office, all the elements of international relations were in flux simultaneously. On On one hand, the industrial democracy has gained the economic well-being and political vitality. Inevitably, this produced a challenge to one previous predominance in our alliances. Most American leaders tend to lay the blame on the awesome, ignorant Charles de Gaulle. I do not share the conventional view of de Gaulle. I saw him not as a cause of current difficulties and doubts, but as a symptom of deep-seated structural changes in Atlantic relationships. It was not natural that the major decision affecting the destinies of the country so rich in the tradition, national pride, and economic strength as Western Europe and Japan should be made 1,000 miles away. I urged for years that it was American national interest to encourage a sharing of responsibilities. If the United States had insisted on being trustee of all communist areas, we have exhausted ourselves psychologically long before we did so physically. A world of more centers of decision, I believe, was fully compatible with our interests as well as our ideals. This is why I oppose the efforts of Kennedy's and Johnson administration to abort the French, if possible even Britain's nuclear programs. In Washington's tendency in the 1960s turns into consolidation into the exegesis of America's prescriptions. At the same time, the so-called third world of developing nations tested our intellectual and political understanding. Our experiences of the New Deal and the Marshall Plan were not entirely relevant to the promoting economic progress and nation building in countries with no political tradition and no middle class of managers and administrations. Instead, the leaders were often overwhelmed by the task of establishing cohesion. We were not dealing with mature economies, but societies taking the wrenching first step towards modernization. It became apparent that nation building depended crucially on the ability of establishing political authority. Economic aid, by accelerating the erosion of traditional and frequent feudal orders, often made political stability even harder to achieve. By one of the ironies of history, Marxism has proved attractive to developing nations not because of its economic theory on which it prides itself, but because it has supplied the answer to the problem of political legitimacy and authority, a formula for social mobilization, a justification for political power, and a means of harnessing resentment against Western cultural and political dominance as a method of fostering unity. Democracy has thus appeared not because of the West's sins, but because the leaders in most developing countries did not undergo the risk of anti-colonial struggle or make themselves disensible by a historical joke. A materialist philosophy that has solved no country economic problem has spread because of its moral claims, while the West, professing an idealistic philosophy, has bemused itself with economic and technical remedies largely irrelevant to the underlying political and spiritual problem. Thus, the new administration confronted the world of turbulence and complexity, which required us qualities that had no precedent in American experience. Simultaneously, we had, at the end of war, managed a global rivalry with the Soviet Union in the shadow of nuclear weapons and reinvigorate our alliances with the industrial democracies and integrate a new nation into the new world equilibrium that would last only if it was compatible with the aspiration of all nations. We had turned a new task of construction even while we had learned the limits of our capacities. We had to find it with ourselves the moral stamina to preserve while our society was assailed by doubt. In the late 18th century, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, in his essay Perpetual Peace, had written that world peace was inevitable. It will come about either because all nations share the same sense of justice, or because a cycle of wars of ever-increasing violence will teach men the futility of conflict. Our period was given new meaning to Kant's predictions. When nations were able to inflict tens of million casualties in a matter of hours, peace has become a moral imperative. No one entering office could evade this fundamental responsibility, but this real dilemma of our time is that if if the conquest for peace turns into the sole objective of policy, and the fear of war becomes a weapon in the hands of most ruthless and reduced moral disarmament. How do you strive for peace and justice for the end of war? That does not mean it does not lead to tyranny, for a commitment for justice that does not produce a cataclysm. To find this balance is a perpetual task of the statesman in the nuclear age. Then these were perceptions about which I had thought and written as much as a professor. They will soon be tested, for once the oath of office had been taken by a new president, there is no longer time to calm reflection. The policymaker is then like a man on a tightrope. He can avoid a precipitous drop only by moving forward. White House Years by Dr. Henry Kissinger, Chapter 3, The Conventions of the Apprentice Statesman.